Hello, I'm Rolando, and I did my research on internet cognitive behavioral therapy, and my partner Rebecca also was my partner in this, and she's going to share her part in a separate video. So to get things started, in this study, they were interested in, can internet cognitive behavioral therapy be effective at decreasing anxiety symptoms in children? And they're also interested in, can it be used as a first step approach before kids received face-to-face cognitive behavioral therapy? Now, internet cognitive behavioral therapy derived from CBT, and CBT has been shown to be very effective at decreasing anxiety symptoms in people overall. So CBT is the acronym for cognitive behavioral therapy, and ICBT is the acronym for internet cognitive behavioral therapy. And throughout this video, I'm going to use the acronyms because these words are a mouthful. Now, I think it's best to break down what CBT is. I'm going to give you guys a brief explanation, and then I'm going to have you watch a video. So the way I understand this is that CBT is when a psychologist is working with a patient at helping them recognize their thoughts. And then once they can do that, they can change their behavior so that they're not held back. So let's say there's an alcoholic. There's a reason why they're drinking all the time. And a psychologist can help them figure out the thoughts that are triggering them to engage in a behavior of drinking. And once they do that, the person can be free because they can engage in better thinking patterns, which is going to direct them to doing better things. That's what CBT sits on, but I'm going to have you guys watch a video too on it so that you can have different perspectives on this topic.
Making Sense of CBT, a guide to what CBT is and how you can decide whether it's best for you. If you're living with a mental health problem, it can be hard to know which way to turn or what to do to feel better. You might go to your GP, and one of the first things they might offer is CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. It combines cognitive therapy, examining the things you think, and behavioral therapy, examining the things you do. The word therapy might make you think of laying on a couch talking to a man with spectacles and a beard about your childhood while he analyzes your dreams. But CBT is actually a very practical type of talking therapy, which focuses on goals and focuses mostly on the present day and things that are affecting you in your life now. The theory behind CBT is that the way we think about situations can affect the way we feel and behave. It does this by dealing with how your thoughts affect your feelings and behaviors, and teaches you coping skills for dealing with different problems. For example, you might make a simple mistake, like, say, burning the dinner. This might make you think bad things, and it might make you feel worthless and inadequate, which could lead you to do things like withdrawing, snapping at your family, or trying to avoid things which you think might go wrong. Or perhaps you've been invited out for drinks with some friends, and you start thinking negative things. This might make you feel anxious and scared, which might make you do something like saying no to the invite, avoiding your friends completely, or using drink and drugs to cope with the situation. Over time, whether it's years, weeks, or months, this cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors may have happened so many times it's become like a habit. You start avoiding situations more and more, or automatically blame yourself if something goes wrong. And the more you do these things, the worse it can get. A CBT therapist will help you break this cycle and figure out what sorts of negative feelings, thoughts, and behaviors might be contributing to the problems you're experiencing. They will help you deal with your negative thinking and help you change your behavior, both of which will lead to an improvement in your mood. CBT can be helpful for people with nearly every diagnosis you can think of, and can be delivered through one-on-one sessions, in groups, self-help books, online, or through a CD-ROM. That doesn't mean that CBT works for everyone, though. Some people struggle with it because they find it just too hard to talk about their feelings. CBT is usually quite a short-term treatment, and so you may find that your problems are too complex to deal with in the time. It can also be quite hard work. Your therapist will probably set you homework, and you have to really practice the skills they teach you to see a difference in how you're feeling. If you don't think CBT is the right treatment for you, you should be able to talk to your GP about what alternatives there are. The Mind website also has lots of information about the different treatments that are available for a wide range of mental health problems. And Mind's info line can also talk to you about what you might find helpful.
Now that we know that ICBT derives from CBT, one thing we should make clear is they're pretty much the same thing, except ICBT is internet-based. And it is pretty much a new approach. There's not really much research on it, but because of how effective and accessible it could be, the researchers thought it'd be good to study. And overall in the study, they found that ICBT was very effective at decreasing anxiety symptoms in children. And they found too, when they combined it with face-to-face CBT, it lowered the symptoms in kids who did not get the symptoms lowered when they did get ICBT. And the study suggests too that ICBT does lower anxiety in the long term, because when they followed the children for the year, it stayed low throughout the whole duration. So based on this, they realized that ICBT can be used as a first step approach. And if it doesn't work, CBT can also be used. And they found it can work in isolation. Now, we really should break down pediatric anxiety disorders. Like, why would you want to get it managed? Because it can really affect the kid's performance in the classroom. They might misbehave a lot. Even at home, their parents might have a hard time working with them because they're just out of control. Pediatric anxiety disorders are a real thing. It's very common amongst children. And CBT has been shown to be very effective. That is why ICBT has been created, because if CBT works, can the internet one work as well? But one thing we should keep in mind is CBT, it's not readily accessible because it's very expensive to get psychologists or find them, because America's healthcare system is not as developed. So that's the drawback with regular CBT. Now, ICBT definitely has potential because it can be very cost effective. It's less cheaper because now it's online. The psychologist doesn't have to be with you one-on-one. And it can also make it easier for people to get treatment for their anxiety disorders. Now, the long-term effects of ICBT is just unknown. There's only been 8 to 10 studies that have been done on it. And a lot of times too, when they're doing these studies with ICBT, they lose the data and they do not properly track the people throughout the study. And they don't really monitor the people's treatment history. And in this study, they made sure to combat all those things so that it did not affect the results they were getting. Now, with ICBT, at the time, the psychologists were having a hard time trying to figure out how can they implement it in a clinical routine care. So if someone went to the hospital, okay, can they get ICBT beforehand, before coming, or no? They just were not sure yet. Because of all those things, they realized doing a study that tracked kids for a year would be the best way to know if this thing is effective. And if it's not effective in isolation, can it be effective if it gets combined with CBT, which has proven to work? Now it's time to break down the study design. So with the study, there was 66 people that received internet cognitive behavioral therapy. And then there was the control group that received internet-delivered child play. That was 65 of them. And after a 12-week period, they told the control group that they could also receive ICBT. So they pretty much pooled the two groups, and 57 participants decided to switch while 8 dropped out. Now, with the pooled sample, we had a total of 123 participants who eventually received ICBT. So it was the 66 initially plus the 57 crossovers. And out of that group, 117 of the participants still met the criteria for having primary anxiety disorder. Now, the recruitment follow-up is a pretty big one. So recruitment went from March 11th, 2015 to October 21st, 2016. And then the follow-up was October 1st, 2015 to April 2nd, 2018. because the study design is pretty complicated, I'm actually gonna put a graph on the screen that we're gonna go straight down, and it'll kind of help you as the viewer kind of understand what was happening in the study, because it gets complicated. There's two groups initially, and then the groups get pooled, and then they both receive ICBT. You can see how it can get pretty complicated. So with this graph, we're gonna start at the top. So we see that there was 123 kids who received ICBT, and 112 provided data at post ICBT. Great. We saw we lost 9 of them. They just did not want to continue, and 2 were just not available for the assessment, so they did not get counted in. And as we go down further, we saw 110 provided data at the 3-month follow-up. And as we go down a bit further, we see after the ICBT, there was 73 that got assessed as not having the anxiety symptoms anymore. So it shows us that ICBT was effective for these kids. And as we keep going down, we see that we lost a few people. Again, we mentioned in these studies that dropouts tend to be very common. That's why it's essential to have a huge sample size. And towards the end, we see 70 provided data at the 12-month follow-up, and we saw that their symptoms did stay low over time. So we lost a tiny bit of people here, but we still kept a good chunk. Now, if we go back up here, we see that there was 37 people who still had the symptoms of anxiety after getting ICBT. And as we go down here, there was 18 of them that decided they wanted face-to-face CBT. And then there was 19 of those people that shows that they did not want face-to-face CBT. And they still had anxiety disorders that met the minimum requirement. And as we go further here, we see why we lost people. So 7 did not wish to continue. They just did not have the motivation. And 12 already got treatment elsewhere. So they did not need the people in this study anymore. And as we keep going down here, we see 2 dropped out. They just did not want to continue. So overall, we saw that there was 18 people that provided data who received face-to-face CBT and internet delivered CBT as well. And here we saw we got to keep most of them as well. So 18 ended up giving us data at the 12-month follow-up here. And if we go here, so they still tracked the people who did not want face-to-face CBT. And when we go down here, we saw 17 provided data at the 12-month follow-up. So we have 3 groups now. And it's because at first it was 2 groups, and one group was receiving the treatment and another was not. And then when they pooled them, that's when the interesting things happened. That's why we've got 3 different groups, because there was already 73 who got assessed and they were fine. So they did not want the face-to-face CBT, but they kept getting tracked regardless. And then they also had the group where they had the regular CBT and also internet CBT, and they tracked them, and they saw when you combine the 2, it was just as effective. And we also had the group who did not want it, and they still followed them. So it's still 2 groups, guys. It's just the way they set it up, it became 3 groups because of people's decisions. The methodology is pretty important, and in this study, the researchers really wanted people with separation anxiety, panic disorders, and generalized anxiety disorders. And the way they went about getting these students was through newspaper ads and also referrals from doctors. And they did get some kids from a center in Sweden. So they were very careful on who they'd bring in. They would not just bring in people with depression and all these other things. And with the study, because we are working with minors, the caregivers had to give a written consent, and the researchers went a bit further and also asked the kids to give verbal consent. And the last thing that had to happen was the Stockholm Regional Ethical Review Board had to approve the study before it even started, mostly because of the minors being involved. But in studies, there tend to be that process where it needs to get reviewed by a board before you do what you got to do. Now, when it comes to measures, The main thing they used was the CSR, which stands for the Clinician Severity Rating. And pretty much it's a scale that ranges from 0 to 8. And 0 means you do not have any of the symptoms of anxiety, and 8 means you have severe symptoms of anxiety. It's pretty much a 9-point Likert scale. And in this study, they used the full scale. They did not modify it whatsoever, because in some studies that can happen. They'll modify the scale because it doesn't address their study. But in this study, it did, so they kept it. And for a child to be considered to have anxiety, they had to have a 4 or higher on the scale. And that's how they went about it throughout the whole study. They would assess them, and if they were not at a 4, that means they were fine. And if they were at a 4 or higher, that means they had clinical anxiety. And with this study, so the psychologists went and did a lot of tests with this scale, and they got an reliability of 77%, which meant that they were getting the same results when they used the scale to assess the kids, which tells us that this was a great measure for assessing anxiety in children. Now, in this study, they had some secondary measures too. They had a whole bunch. I'm going to put all of them on the screen for you guys to see. So with all these measures, they were able to get a lot of meaningful results, and they could compare them to each other and the primary measures. So now they had a lot more data to work with to see that the treatment they were given across the board was going to influence all those scales. Now, if they just had one scale, the results might not be as meaningful, because there could have been a number of things that are influencing those scales. But if they have a lot of scales that they can compare to their data to, it's just way more meaningful, because now they can be like, okay, here we saw it went down, here we saw it went down. That means our treatment works. Now if it was just one scale, all they could say is they went down on this scale, and the evidence is just not as strong. But because they had a lot of other measures, it just made their case way stronger that ICBT is effective at lowering anxiety in children. Now, a few last things. Doing follow-up, the researchers were very sure that the kids were not getting treatment elsewhere, or also getting SSRI, which is medication that can help them lower the anxiety levels, because that could also influence the study. So they made sure that wasn't happening, which could have been almost like the third factor. And another thing too, so doing the ICBT and face-to-face CBT, they made sure the kids were not exposed to any traumatic events, because that could also influence the study as well. So those were just some last additional things when it came to the measures. Now, with the interventions that got used, there was 2 of them, and it was the ICBT and CBT. We talked about them a bit in the beginning. I'm going to go a bit deeper now into them. I'm going to pretty much explain what ICBT is. So it's really known as the BIB anxiety, and it's a fully web-based therapist-guided self-help CBT program, and it's designed for children with anxiety and their caregivers. And the treatment has 12 modules that they have to follow, and the parents also have 12 separate modules that are directed towards them. And the duration of treatment is 12 weeks, and the participants must complete one module before moving on to the next, because if they could skip around, then we would not really be sure if one module was working better than the other. So because of this system, it just really allowed the psychologist to track everything effectively. And the primary component of the intervention is self-guided exposure therapy, supported by asynchronous and personalized therapist guidance delivered weekly through messages within the treatment platform. And the psychologists definitely had worksheets that they could utilize to keep track of all this. So throughout this whole thing, a psychologist was always present, checking in weekly or so to be sure that everything was going on track. So they did not just send the parents and the kids alone and had them figure it out, because if that was the case, they could be doing it wrong, and maybe we would not get any meaningful results. So because there was a psychologist on board as often as possible, we knew that this is very effective. Now, there was also intervention 2, which was face-to-face CBT, and that was for non-remitters. And essentially, it was for people who got ICBT and they still had symptoms of anxiety. And so the FACE CBT was provided at the Stockholm Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Center. And the content of the face-to-face CBT was pretty much similar to the online one, except it was face-to-face, and they focused on exposure therapy as well. And the participants were offered 10 sessions of face-to-face CBT, and it lasted 60 minutes for a 12-week period. The treatment included both the parent and the child. Now, when it came to the first session, it involved discussing why ICBT might not have worked, because it's not going to be a one pill that kind of fits everybody. And they also tried to figure out ways to be sure that they were more successful with the face-to-face treatment. So they kind of broke it into phases, and they had the parents more involved in it as well. And the last session really focused on preventing relapse. So if the kid has anxiety, they try to give them strategies that they could utilize in real time so that their anxiety doesn't control them. And yeah, that was pretty much the process for the face-to-face CBT for the people who were not successful with ICBT. Now, with research like this, you definitely need an effective way to analyze the data. And what the researchers used was a linear mixed model, and the acronym is LMM. I'm going to throw one on the screen for you, and essentially they get used to track symptom change over time. So for the people who got ICBT, we're able to put 1 point from the beginning and then also at the end to track all those changes. And after that, the psychologists were able to combine all the linear mixed models to get a sense of how they were similar and different. And there was a lot of statistical work that got done in the back end to give them those meaningful results. And that's why they were able to convert it into a lot of graphs so that we could read the data more easily. Because if you were to look at all the graphs in isolation, they just would not make sense, because they're tracking the kids for a long duration of time. And in isolation, they don't make sense, but when you combine them and compare them, you can see that ICBT was effective in isolation, and face-to-face CBT and ICBT were also good at lowering anxiety symptoms. And we saw that for the group that did not want face-to-face CBT, their symptoms still lowered, but that was because they were getting treatment elsewhere, which was also being accounted for. So pretty much anything that could have been accounted for in a study, the psychologists accounted for and could explain it very well. And yeah, so guys, with this study, I liked it a lot. It's definitely a big one, very complicated because there's a lot of moving parts. Most studies are not this complicated. The only reason why this study got very confusing is because there's 2 groups initially, and then they get pooled. And then because they get pooled, there becomes 3 groups, because there are people who were cured after getting the treatment, so they did not need the face-to-face CBT. And there was people who did not want face-to-face CBT, but they still had the symptoms. And then there were people that had the symptoms and they got face-to-face CBT, and they also had ICBT. So the group split happened because of the decisions the kids chose to make within the study. Because it could have just stayed 2 groups. So one group got ICBT, and then the other group got face-to-face CBT and ICBT, and they would have followed those 2 groups. The 3rd group occurred because some kids just did not want the face-to-face CBT. And we also saw there was a lot of dropouts within the study as well. But overall, I really think it was a great study. The psychologists really took the initiative to be sure that they were actually curing these children based on ICBT. And I also liked how they had a lot of measures. All those measures are just essential because it's given them a lot of readings. And if all the measures are shown across the board, that the kids' anxiety symptoms are lowering in a lot of different facets, then that is telling us that this treatment is very good. And you guys will see this further when my partner Rebecca talks to you about the results in the discussion. You'll see that this was very meaningful. They got a lot of great data from doing this study, because now they see that ICBT can be given to children and it's going to lower their anxiety tremendously. And if it doesn't work, now they can give them face-to-face CBT, and that can solve the issue as well. So the psychologist found the answer to both of their problems. Can ICBT get rid of anxiety symptoms in children? Yes. Can it be used as the first step approach and then they get face-to-face CBT? The answer was yes. And so this is the end of my part, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'm gonna peace out now. Thank you for watching this.